My guest in the Nimataion today is Richard Gavin, and together we are spinning a yarn. Richard, you're an author of weird fiction, an esotericist, in other words, a colleague. Happy
Yes,
to have you here.
exactly. Yeah, so I'm very happy to be here. So it's nice to talk to you. Thank you for the invitation.
Great, thank you. Richard, what has been your favorite childhood story?
Well, that is a question that I put a lot of thought into. I'll have to talk just really briefly about what I was like as a child, which was very much sensing a world beneath or just outside of this one. And why this was, I don't know. It was just a natural affinity that I had. And because of that, ghost stories, gothic horror stories, supernatural horror, when these things came into my life, which happened very young, possibly because of Halloween, which we celebrate here in Canada, um, I took to them with this urgency where I poured over the stories because it felt to me that these were stories that spoke to how I perceive the world. I found the day-to-day
Totally.
world. Yeah, exactly. I had a feeling this would not come as unusual to you and probably to a lot of your viewers as
Mhm.
well. So because of that, I devoured anything I could find in that field. Um, but I was really thinking back to, and the story that I've chosen to talk about a little bit today is one that's not terribly well known. It's not immensely obscure, but it's a story called The Apparition by Guy de Maupassant. Now, it's a 19th century French writer. He was very famous for a number of supernatural stories. The reason I chose this one, and I'll give a brief sort of plot summary of it as well for those who may not know it. I first encountered it on an album that was given me by my grandmother. Actually, was just a selection of famous ghost stories. So it had stories by Charles Dickens and Edgar Allan Poe and Washington Irving, and it had a story which on that record was titled Le Spectre, but it's Apparition. And the plot is quite simple. It begins with a man of advanced age recounting something that had happened 56 years earlier. And at that point, he was a younger man who encountered a childhood friend on the street. And he was taken aback because this friend looked noticeably older. He walked with a stoop. His hair was white. He just did not, he looked well beyond his years. And as they became reacquainted, the friend tells our narrator about how he had fallen desperately in love with a woman, married her, and then he believes because of love, the woman took ill and died. And because of this man boarded up his chateau in the country and moved to the city and has not been back. And then, of course, stories operating the way that they do, he then um, says to the narrator that there are some very important documents that are locked up in the upstairs room of this abandoned house. He doesn't trust anyone else. Can you please just go and fetch them? The narrator agrees, goes out, and it's what he finds is the archetypal abandoned house, overgrown gardens. The house is dilapidated. He enters the home, uses the keys that he's given, and enters the bedroom in the upper floor of this chateau. And as he's collecting the papers, he hears a rustling behind him, and he is at this point quite frightened. It's pitch black in this room. He's basically doing what he can. And then he describes how he's then able, his eyes grow accustomed, he's able to almost see in the dark. And he then hears a low, lamenting sigh behind him and turns, and there is a woman in a white gown with long black hair standing by this chair. And she asks if he will help her. And when the narrator, who is stricken with terror, asks what he can do, this apparition says, "Comb my hair because I am suffering." So the man dutifully, she sits in the chair and he combs her hair, and he describes it as though he's handling snakes. And when he finishes, she takes the comb, enters into a closed door, and disappears. And the man struggles to try and figure out what had happened, goes back to his own home, and he can't figure out why he's stricken with his terror. And he returns to his own room, and finds that there are a number of these long black hairs on his jacket, which he then throws in there. They scatter in the wind. And it basically, I apologize for spoilers, but it basically ends with him recounting this to, the reader or presumably another friend. And he basically says, I don't know what this means. My friend, I never saw him again. He never came to collect the papers. He disappeared. There's been no reports of anything else in the house. And that's it. So when you look at this structurally, it's a very simple structure of a story. It's very basic. It's not an overly long story. But the reason I've chosen it is because it took me many years. After listening to it repeatedly, I eventually found the story and read it numerous times, going all the way into adulthood. And it was only as a man, when I went back and looked at it, that I was able to parse all of these elements that were so key to my life. The exploration of abandoned and forsaken houses, the allure of the abandoned, that notion of a liminal space that is not quite earthly, but not quite of a totally sublime realm, something that was kind of an in between haunted state. And I think most importantly for myself would be the feminine, the apparition of a divine feminine. Because again, as a child, I was like, well, is she a gorgon? Were her hairs actually snakes? Why? And so when I look back, it's really not. Again, this is why I've chosen it. It's not the kind of story that you would think would appeal to a child.
No, no, it has something Aikman-esque about it.
Yeah, absolutely. There's so much ambiguity and there's so
Mm.
much it doesn't have that kind of satisfying resolve. There's nothing in terms of I can understand why the Legend of Sleepy Hollow appealed to me as a very young child, right? The chase and these things you can see would have an appeal to a young imagination,
That's a
but this had none of that.
satisfying
Yes, yeah,
conclusion.
and there's
Yeah, and
exactly. So there's a strong lack of resolution. It opens the ambiguity, and again, this narrator is basically shrugging his shoulders, saying, "It terrified me. I am now afraid of the dark, and I know that this happened." So I think that all of those elements combined really, I think, spoke to me. I think this is what's so fascinating about supernatural fiction, folk tales, folklore, is you take them in as a young child and they become seeds. You plant them. You're not even aware that your subconscious is kind of tending these because it is giving you instruction. It is tutelary. It is teaching you something probably about your own life,
mm,
and the world around you. So that's why I've chosen Apparition by Guy de Maupassant, because it seemed out of place even for a child who was so fascinated with this genre. It was such an adult tale. It was such an ambiguous tale that I can't even today fully parse what it was that had that appeal, other than the fact that it was pointing to, later aspects of my own life and my own spiritual path, um, and these important principles that were going to continue to recur throughout my life.
yeah, yeah. It's like these stories they guide us on, in this case, a very uneasy way. But
Hmm.
we like the feeling of uneasiness, don't we?
Yes, absolutely. And this is the thing, that when we have those moments of ambiguity and uneasiness and uncertainty, you can feel that you're entering, you're going beyond what was a comfortable and familiar way of reckoning the world, and you're entering into something new. And that's what's fascinating about it, as well, as you mentioned, is that there is this paradox of the attraction and the repulsion to these kinds of things. They're frightening, but we also know that beyond the thrills and chills of these types of stories, there is, I firmly believe this, that the ghost story, the supernatural horror story, the weird tale, they carry on a kind of metaphysical, spiritual, almost religious view of the world that is running a great risk of being lost entirely in contemporary culture.
Yeah,
And I think that's why it is such an important genre. I think that's why so many people are attracted to it, even though they may not regard themselves as spiritual people or believers in ghosts and so forth. There is something that is really at the core of these types of stories that goes far deeper than entertainment.
Absolutely, absolutely. They hint at the numinous.
Mm-hmm.
And
Absolutely.
I was thinking when you told about it, I recently read a comic book by Terry Laban, Muktuk Wolfsbreath. I don't know if you know it.
No, I'm not familiar with that one.
It's set in Siberia. It's a
Okay.
Muktuk is a traditional shaman. It's a nondescribed past, and the genre is noir. It's a like a hard-boiled detective fiction, and it shouldn't work, but it works perfectly. And in one occasion, Muktuk goes into trance to follow the evil, and
Mm-hmm.
he goes to the underworld, and the goddess of all evil, she sits at the bottom of the sea, and all the sins of the humans, they come down to her, and he has to comb them out of her hair.
Oh, really?
That,
Okay, that's fascinating. That's an
yeah,
interesting synchronicity there for
yeah,
sure.
isn't it? I just read it, and that's a mythology, like
Mm-hmm.
the woman in white, and so Guy de Maupassant, consciously or subconsciously, put together several archetypic archetypes or
Mm-hmm.
archetypal patterns, and I think these are what we're attracted to.
I would agree. I would completely agree. I think these happen at such a deep level of the human psyche that we're not even, we can't be conscious of how these things operate, how they work, how they seek one another out, what we're attracted to, what's repellent to us.
Mm.
Yeah, and it runs so deep that that's a perfect example. Here, you've just recently read this comic, which I'm not familiar with, but it sounds great.
Yeah.
And it of course has a resonant thread right through to this story that we talked about today. So this again, these are the types of things that I urge all the viewers, readers of this type of work. These are the things you pay attention to, because these are the things that, even though you're not consciously constructing them, they manifest in your life, and they're important signifiers for what is really crucial to us as individuals.
And there we have it, guys. That's where stories lead us. Richard, thank you so much for participating in this interview series. It has been an absolute pleasure talking to you. I
It's
look
it's
forward.
been a pleasure for me as well.
See you.
Thank you. Bye bye.
The world is magical.